Kautilya'S Arthashastra, an overview. 1. In 3rd century BC lived Kautilya, one of the most fascinating characters in Indian history. His seminal work Arthashastra ought to be read by all, be they statesmen, business managers or academic scholars. Indeed, Kautilya'S Arthashastra is being studied, not only in India, but everywhere in the world, for its deep insights and relevance, even 2,400 years after it was written. In order to truly appreciate the significance of Arthashastra, it is necessary to go back in time and study ancient Indian culture. Kautilya belonged to the Magadh state, which corresponds to present-day South Bihar. Magadh was then the biggest state in India. Kautilya, who was also called Chanakya or Vishnugupta, studied at one of the world's oldest universities, Takshashila University. The subjects studied there were politics, defense, architecture, medicine, and a few others. He joined Chandragupta Maurya's empire, after a brief stint with the previous Nanda dynasty. He served as the Mahamatya in the Mauryan Empire, a post similar to the present-day Prime Minister, and thus possessed rich experience in political administration and defense matters. Eventually, Kautilya became an intelligent scholar, fearless thinker, capable secretary, and astute politician. Later, he retired from active politics and took upon the monumental task of writing the Arthashastra. Being a profound scholar, he studied the literature available to him on subjects like philosophy, religion, politics, and diplomacy. However, he came out with an independent account and commentary of his own in the form of Arthashastra. This document is more a tome than a book on economics. Kautilya wrote a comprehensive account encompassing political administration and defense matters. In the process, he came to the conclusion that economics was the most important aspect of public life as it provided the basis for human existence and survival. Kautilya concentrated on things that were relevant to his time, viz., agriculture, cattle breeding, and trade. However, while commenting on other matters of administration, Kautilya made reference to different dimensions that have a strong bearing on economics. Thus, Kautilya provided a detailed analysis of public finance, taxation, public expenditure, and investments, appointment of ministers and other state officials, and many other matters concerning governance of the state. Of special interest to the readers in India would be an elaborate description of how public funds can get misappropriated and how such practices could be contained and controlled. As for agriculture, Kautilya went into minute details about cultivation, farming, and trading transactions essentially in farm products. Looking at the whole document, it can definitely be said that Kautilya was attempting to set down ways of achieving excellence in economic and business management. Economic thought process. Kautilya's major contribution to the economic thought process could be seen in the area of public finance. He attached considerable importance to financial management by the state, recognizing that the financial strength of the state is critical in normal times as also in times of war, famine, and other calamities. Kautilya referred to 7 different sources of revenue, classifying them as routine sources, like taxes on land and commerce, and additional sources, such as interest and profits. At the same time, he enumerated 15 heads of expenditure. While levying taxes, he advocated fairness and equity as the basis of taxation. He also made a strong case for avoiding discontent among the taxpayers, as the welfare of citizens was uppermost in his mind. The concept of subsidies and exemptions seems to have prevailed in Kautilya's times too. He indicated that these exemptions should be judiciously planned and provided to women, minors, students, disabled, and others. While commenting on public finance, Kautilya showed remarkable foresight and suggested ways for investments in virgin land, dams, tanks, irrigation, and mining. How relevant this is even today can be seen from the mention made about conservation of water resources in the last 2 budgets. These assets undoubtedly were of critical importance in Kautilya's times from the point of view of economic planning. It is necessary to extend this logic and prepare an exhaustive list of productive assets in the context of a modern economy like India. Kautilya's suggestions as regards investments are admirably suited to India, and important lessons can be drawn from Arthashastra in this regard. Equally important is Kautilya's contribution in the management of agriculture, which he believed was the basis for any economy. Kautilya pointed out that besides providing food grains to feed the people, agriculture also provided revenue, employment and food for the army personnel to the state, and, hence, he treated land as a very important asset. He had an exhaustive methodology for cultivation, selection of seeds and, more importantly, forecasting weather conditions and rainfall. Given the fact that this was done 2,400 years ago, it is remarkable that he advocated a scientific approach to farm operations and management. Kautilya classified land into arable and non-cultivable land. Arable land was given to the farmers for life only, and Kautilya insisted that taxes were paid by farmers. India, at present, is engaged in a debate about tax on agricultural income, which still remains inconclusive. Kautilya provided a rational defense of his decision. He also advocated that rich farmers be taxed at higher rates. Kautilya argued for maintaining data on agriculture, since this provided necessary information for revenue assessment and collection. He made suggestions for the improvement of land records too. This is yet another subject which needs to be emphasized in the present context, as many Indian states do not have proper land records. Absence of land records inhibits the carrying out of land reforms. Kautilya also pointed out that irrigation should be planned and there should be a provision for buffer stock, which is a state responsibility. Kautilya realized the need to give relief to needy citizens and hence suggested that tax-free land should be allocated to certain specified categories of people. Kautilya wrote a very scientific and articulate book on agricultural economics. It is amazing that he showed such great vision and foresight while talking about agriculture, which ensured a sustainable basis for human existence and livelihood. Trade and commerce. Kautilya'S Arthashastra also discusses trade and commerce. Trade, whether in farm goods or other manufactured items, was largely under the control of the state during his time. Trading operations were supervised and controlled by the superintendent of trade. The prices of traded goods were fixed by the state after undertaking the process of costing, allowing a profit margin of 5% on domestic goods and 10% on foreign goods. In his book, Exports and Imports refer not to foreign countries, but to neighboring Indian states. Kautilya laid down procedures for such foreign trade transactions, along with methods for price fixation too. Kautilya attached considerable importance to weights and measures used for trade, which were standardized in those days. While the medium of exchange was silver and copper coins, barters were practiced whenever necessary. Kautilya also made suggestions for the development and maintenance of trade routes. Today, we talk about the importance of the Golden Quadrilateral Highway. It must be remembered that Kautilya emphasized that interests of traders, consumers and the ruling state must be borne in mind while organizing trade and commerce. He had the concept of welfare state on his mind in all his teachings. This is interesting, because today, balancing various interests in order to introduce VAT has become a major issue. We also find references to industry, mining and manufacturing in Kautilya'S Arthashastra. Not modern industry, of course, but industries that existed then. Reference is made to the textile industry engaged in the production of wool, bark fiber, cotton and hemp. Chariots were used in those times and hence, industrial activity in the manufacture of such items existed in Kautilya's times. Apart from investment of state funds in mines, Kautilya made suggestions for renewal and renovation of discarded mines. It is interesting that gold and silver held great appeal in Kautilya's times too. Besides, mines for copper, lead, tin, and iron ore were developed. Manufacture of defense weapons, coins and implements for farming operations were undertaken in those times. There existed a total state monopoly on mining and manufacturing, and the private sector did not exist in any form in these sectors. The state enjoyed a commanding position on treasury and defense operations and hence its total control on the relevant industrial activity. Labor policy and HRD practices. Kautilya devoted a lot of his attention to labor policies and human resource development matters. However, these were with reference to state service and procedures to be followed by the state for the recruitment of ministers, secretaries and other officers. Besides, detailed procedures were indicated for conducting tests, fixing remuneration, for rotation of duties, and promotions. While laying down these guidelines, Kautilya opined that the treatment of the labor force had to be fair, yet strict. Even though the concept of HRD has not been mentioned specifically in Kautilya'S Arthashastra, all these guidelines give an impression that Kautilya was propounding human resource development in a detailed manner. He believed in the welfare state, and his labor policy and administrative procedures were in tune with that spirit in a broad sense. Kautilya put forward an elaborate process of selection of ministers, secretaries, palace attendants, financial accountants, administrative officers, secret agents, and ambassadors of state. Apart from the technical competence and knowledge, Kautilya stipulated that qualities, such as spirit, intelligence, integrity, and loyalty must be thoroughly examined. Kautilya also indicated methods for salary fixation and insisted that there be differentiation in salary in order to compensate officers with superior qualities. He also explained how duties and responsibilities of state officers should be fixed and what penalties should be imposed for non-fulfillment of duties. Kautilya was also aware of the need for education and training of the different functionaries. He drew up detailed instructions about the training and familiarization of the king and the heir apparent with various subjects relevant to administration and defense. HRD matters have become very important in India. The new economic regime, with its focus on globalization, has made it imperative to adopt an appropriate HRD approach. Lessons can be drawn from Kautilya'S Arthashastra on how HRD can be conveniently tackled in the current economic circumstance prevailing in India. Governance. It is finally necessary to understand the concept of governance, as explained by Kautilya. He wrote about governance in the context of a monarchic state, and the principles enumerated by him were with reference to governance of such a state. The CEO of the state is the king, and Kautilya described in detail the king's duties, his background, and his supreme position in all matters concerning the state. Kautilya prescribed a comprehensive daily routine, divided into 7 phases from early morning to late evening, so that the king's time was spent effectively on efficient administration. According to Kautilya, the king should possess knowledge of philosophy, old scriptures, political ethics, diplomacy, and the functioning of the economy. In terms of good governance, Kautilya commented that the king should administer law and justice. He said that the king was the final arbiter and the fountain of justice. The classification of legal matters into civil and criminal is found in Kautilya'S Arthashastra. He laid down elaborate guidelines for administering justice in terms of evidence, procedures, and witnesses. Kautilya strongly believed in dandanity, though he maintained that penalties must be fair and just, and proportionate to the offense committed. As for the state's political administration, Kautilya provided a full-fledged commentary on how this should be effectively undertaken. He gave instructions about the defense of the state's boundaries, protection of the forts, and the manner in which an invasion by the enemy should be handled. The day-to-day functions to be performed by the prince, ministers, and other state officials were described by Kautilya. He also assigned importance to expanding and consolidating the state's position. Kautilya was preoccupied with the task of consolidation of the Maurya Empire into a unified central regime, and having achieved these goals, he knew exactly how this task could be accomplished. Kautilya believed in the end result and hence was not too sensitive about the means deployed. He upheld moral and ethical standards in his personal life. However, he was straightforward in recommending means, fair or foul, in achieving the goals of the state. In fact, many scholars criticized him on this score. Yet another aspect of good governance enumerated by Kautilya concerns misappropriation of state funds. He prepared an exhaustive list of dubious methods employed for embezzlement of funds and other similar malpractices. He explained how checks and balances should be administered for the containment of malpractices. This is perhaps among the most important lessons that can be learned by the administrators of India. Identifying corrupt practices and prescribing strict and stringent remedies and penalties for the containment of such practices is the most urgent task and challenge faced by India. The enforcement machinery could benefit from the study of Kautilya'S Arthashastra specifically from this point of view. Relevance of Kautilya'S Arthashastra. A deep understanding of Kautilya'S Arthashastra would offer important lessons in contemporary times too. Even though the circumstances prevailing in Kautilya'S times were vastly different, his teachings have a universal appeal. He was charting a path for economic prosperity through entrepreneurship and astute strategizing to achieve prosperity under any situation. Kautilya realized that wealth creation was crucial for establishing a welfare state. He outlined and advocated appropriate strategies for creation, protection and conservation of a nation's wealth. Kautilya's specific commentary on areas like public finance and treasury, investments in productive assets, techniques of agriculture and cattle breeding, and trade and commerce would be found to be very useful and relevant to this day. Obviously, these strategies need to be suitably adapted, given the prevailing political and social environment as also the availability of advanced technologies. Apart from these specific issues, Kautilya'S Arthashastra could be treated as the quintessence of the art of good governance. Apart from broad principles of governance, Kautilya provided techniques for enforcement of law and justice. The universality of his teaching stems from his focus on techniques required to enforce principles. His sense of pragmatism in matters of governance needs to be imbibed by politicians and practicing managers, apart from research scholars. India is endowed with a rich treasure trove of knowledge, with books such as Arthashastra and other such documents that have been well preserved over many centuries. The present-day economic administrators would immensely benefit from Kautilya's teachings with suitably adapted applications in diverse areas of our economy. Kautilya's emphasis on excellence in economic and business management remains relevant in today's globalized environment. Kautilya as an economist. 2. N. Kautilya'S Arthashastra. There are a number of economic concepts and ideas which have parallels in the modern theory of economics. Often Kautilya'S economic theories are implicit rather than explicit, which is understandable because he did not write a book on economics as we know it to be today. The economic ideas expressed in the Arthashastra are not new to the modern economist, but what is amazing is that Kautilya had developed these thoughts some 400 years ago. Many of the same ideas have been rediscovered and restated since his time. Perhaps one could call Kautilya the father of economics in India. If one were to read his thoughts on domestic commercial policies, one knows that he understood well the relationship between demand and supply in the determination of price. He even wrote about the estimation of demand and control of supply. According to him, a king should not arbitrarily fix the price of a product without regard to its supply and demand. Even today, largely for social considerations, prices of certain products are arbitrarily fixed, which have their effects on other areas, usually fiscal. For example, kerosene is subsidized for social reasons, as it is a cheap fuel. This subsidy is borne by the state, and state-owned oil companies. However, it is also misused as a substitute for diesel, which harms the environment. Kautilya advocated the concept of just price. The just price was designed to maintain the incentive for business people by allowing them 5 to 10% profit in their operations. As state-owned businesses competed with private businesses, the conflict of interest was clear. Kautilya suggested some parity in price be maintained such that the private sector was not choked off. He indicated that an arbitrary price cannot be dictated from above without regard to the cost of production, the ratio of supply to demand, a reasonable level of profit, etc. When there was a glut of any commodity, the state-designated state official, Panchadhyaka, was expected to intervene and centralize the sale of that commodity so that the price did not slump. Apparently, the entire supply was purchased and its sale carried out through the agency of the state at a fixed price. All in all, the text reveals a definite attempt to strike a reasonable balance between the interests of the state, the traders and the consumers. Often, however, the interests of the consumers are regarded as supreme. The Panchadhyaka was expected to be an expert in determining the values of various commodities and always be updated with the demand and supply situations of the commodities involved. Any kind of price collusion by the groups and associations of merchants was discouraged by heavy fines. Foreign trade. Well before the World Trade Organization, Kautilya clearly understood the advantages of foreign trade and strongly encouraged it. In fact, he recommended that experts be sent to study foreign markets and determine which commodities could be imported and exported profitably. He encouraged imports but understood that it could not be a one-way trade, hence, for the long term, he suggested a balance between import and export be maintained. He does not display any of the fears of foreign trade that the mercantilists after him had displayed. He stated that before a successful trade contract can be established, it must be beneficial to all countries involved, surely a principle that would underlie modern-day trade agreements between countries. There must be a price advantage and a profit to be made. Hence, the possibility of increased consumption and a profit motive seem to be the dominant factors in encouraging foreign trade. Foreign trade, however, was regulated, not everything could be imported or exported. Kautilya laid down general and specific policies regarding all aspects of trade, which seem too complex and strangely modern. Trade policy. There was a clear-cut role for the state in seeking and analyzing market access. In some ways, the role envisaged by Kautilya for the state in seeking foreign markets, i.e., analysis of price and demand, tariff and transportation costs and market information, is very similar to the brief of modern trade policy departments in various countries. Having ascertained the value of local produce as compared with that of foreign produce that can be obtained in barter, the superintendent will find out by calculation whether there is any margin left for profit after meeting the payments to the foreign king, such as the toll, sulka, road, cess, vartans, conveyance cess, atavahika, tax payable at military stations, gulmadare, ferry charges, taradare, subsistence to the merchant and his followers, bhakta, and the portion of merchandise payable to the foreign king, bagar. For Kautilya, information gathering and lobbying was a prerequisite for trade activities. Having gathered information as to transactions in commercial towns along the banks of rivers, the officer shall transport his merchandise to profitable markets and avoid unprofitable ones. Risk and uncertainty. Kautilya related the levels of risk and uncertainty to levels of profits and interests. He opined that higher levels of risk and uncertainty need to be compensated by the chance of receiving higher profits or interest. For example, he recommended the allowable profit on imports to be twice as high as on domestic goods. The associated risk was considered to be an important reason for allowing 10% of profits on imports and only 5% on domestic products. This was because not only did imports require a lock-in of large amounts of capital, but also because of the danger of goods being stolen in transit. Showing an early understanding of risk and reward, Kautilya provides a very detailed analysis of interest rate structures and the importance of having correct structures of interest rates and debt recovery mechanisms. Kautilya provides for different interest rate structures for different sectors of the economy. He states, 5 panas per month per 100 is commercial interest, Vyavariki, 10 panas per month per 100 prevails among forests. 20 panas per month per 100 prevails among sea traders, Samudanam, clearly showing that the riskier the venture, the greater the interest should be, taking into account the higher risk. Kautilya believed that the state should have some watch over commercial activities that affect the general welfare of the state, i.e., the nature of the transactions between creditors and debtors, on which the welfare of the kingdom depends, shall always be scrutinized. This idea is similar to present-day systems of watchdogs that supervise commercial activities, central banks, securities and exchanges boards, etc., and provide legitimacy and security to them to make the business environment robust. Unlike Aristotle, who considered charging interest on loans as unjust, Kautilya outlined a structure of rates based upon the type of loans, factors affecting interest rate, methods of calculating interest and the circumstances when interest may not be collected by the lenders. Interest rates in his time varied from 1.25–2% per month, primarily, depending upon two factors, the risk involved and the potential productivity of the money borrowed. The interest rate on secured loan for personal needs such as to meet marriage expense was at the lower end of the spectrum, at 1.25% per month. The rate was higher for trade. In the case of ordinary local trade the rate was 5% per month, but the rate doubled for those trading in forest products. The traders who traveled to forest areas were subjected to greater risk from animals and robbers. Further, the business in forest products was more profitable. The highest rate of 20% per month was charged to those who engaged in overseas trade, considered to be the most risky but also the most profitable of businesses. Commercial bankers today would salivate at the thought of such rates. The rate of interest was also high on loans taken by a group of people, rather than that taken by an individual. It was felt that since the group would share the burden of interest, it would not fall heavily on any one individual. Moreover, the group was generally in a better position to pay high interest because it was involved in larger projects with greater profit potential such as foreign trade. Creditors could not charge an interest not approved by the state. Further, certain groups of people, due to their inability to pay, sickness, bankruptcy, or due to the nature of their work, student, were exempt from paying interest. The privilege, however, had to be earned by the person by the process of law. 5 different kinds of interest were distinguished by Kautilya: compound interest, periodical interest, stipulated interest, daily interest, and the use of a pledged article. Indeed, the idea of expressing interest as a percentage originated in India. Thus, overall, the Kautilyan system of interest seems quite elaborate, complex, and even modern. Wages. Kautilya used 3 criteria in prescribing wages for state employees. He indicated that the wage should be high enough to maintain the loyalty of high-ranking officials, to evoke the needed efficiency and effort, and to reflect the relative standing of their occupation. He recommended that the aggregate wage bill of the state should not exceed 1/4 of its revenue. The Finance Commission would do well to study the chapter on wages. In determining wages in private industries, Kautilya used a variety of factors such as the quality and quantity of work, market value of the final product, the market value of the inputs, etc. The wage differed between the industries based upon skill and technology required, and within the industry based upon the quality and quantity of work done. Higher wages were paid for overtime work done during holidays. The labor market was quite competitive. Those who could not compete joined the ranks of the unemployed and the unskilled labor force, with their wages appreciably reduced. The concept of contractual wages also existed. The quality and the quantity of work to be performed were specified for a certain sum of wages. A general review of the industries described by Kautilya indicates a trend towards specialization and use of mechanical devices to improve the quality and quantity of output. In Arthashastra, there is a definite effort to formulate a wage policy based on the realistic understanding of the economic, social, and political factors. The emerging policy must be just, and must be consistent with the interest of the state as a capitalist. For Kautilya, the state is a party to any labor or wage legislation together with farmers, merchants, and industrialists. The policy suggested in Arthashastra attempts to strike a balance between the delicate interests of the parties involved. Kautilya indicates that although the state holds a privileged position of a monopolist, it should cooperate with the private sector for proper utilization of resources. Further, a strong private sector is a source of strength to the state. Money and banking. In Kautilya's economy, there is no restriction on the supply of money. The supply and demand for money seem to take care of themselves without any interference from the state. It seems the restriction on the supply of money comes from the availability of gold and silver, the 2 important metals used in the manufacture of coins. In manufacturing coins, both gold, for gold coins, and silver, for silver coins, had to be mixed with definite proportions of other alloys. Any individual could have his gold or silver converted into coins at the state mint for a fee. Different denominations of coins were used for transactions. It seems the supply of money was not used for controlling economic activities. Kautilya also envisaged the idea of a rudimentary banking system that kept the wealth of guilds and artisans in safekeeping. He recommends that the banker should have a good understanding of the workings of the artisans, should be reliable, and be a person of good standing. Modern-day banks indeed serve all these functions, i.e., they have to build trust and stature within the community to conduct the business and have to have a good understanding of markets to be successful. In Kautilya's words, those who can be expected to relieve misery, who can give instructions to artisans, who can be trusted with deposits, who can plan artistic work after their own design, and who can be relied upon by guilds of artisans, may receive the deposits of the guilds. The guilds, Sranai, shall receive the deposits back in times of distress. One must marvel at the depth of Kautilya's pragmatic philosophy underlying his work in Arthashastra. Although he did not write a book on economics per se, he has expressed and highlighted many economic ideas when it comes to managing the affairs of the state as early as in the 3rd century BC. Since then, many of his economic thoughts have been rediscovered and restated by many prominent economists and philosophers. Kautilya should earn his rightful place among the stalwarts of economic ideas. Free market economy. 3. Kautilya believed that the state had a role in the market as a regulator. Such a view would not be very different from the actual practice in current free market economies, where the state is expected to provide the institutions required for the efficient conduct of economic activities. This chapter focuses on Kautilya's concept of a market economy, how governments can play the role of a facilitator, the need for institution building for the efficient functioning of a market system, and how a consumer's interest could be protected by preventing unfair trade practices. All of these are relevant, and strike a chord in the minds of today's consumers. Kautilya was meticulous in outlining, in detail, the technique of controlling practically every aspect of economic activity. However, his prescription for control was to discipline and streamline the various economic activities for the greatest economic welfare of the state. Kautilya viewed the welfare of the state to be coterminous with the prosperity of its subjects. He outlined the techniques for regulating agriculture, domestic non-agricultural businesses, as well as foreign trade. Definite wage structure and policies were instituted in accordance with the product produced. The employee and employer relationship was monitored to prevent exploitation of labor or disruption of production by the workers. The state ensured that all the contractual obligations between them were fulfilled, as this would be in the interest of the state to see that production did not cease. The output was not allowed to be sold at the point of origin, it was to be sold only in designated marketplaces so that price regulation on products could be systematically applied. The state determined the prices of products based upon the estimate of demand and supply. The price was so regulated that it allowed a profit of 5% for local business, and about 10% for foreign trade. The state often controlled the supply if the predetermined price could not be maintained. It also provided social overhead capital and often gave tax incentives for businesses to operate profitably. In theory, the state had absolute control over all aspects of economic activities. In practice, it allowed and even encouraged the growth of private businesses. It was recognized that the wealth of a state depended upon the wealth of the people, hence, it could not stifle individual initiatives in production and profit. While the economic welfare of the subjects and private businesses were not in conflict with the welfare of a state, Kautilya streamlined all economic, administrative, political, legal and social activities to strengthen the state. Though Kautilya envisaged a very strong supervisory role for the government in the conduct of commercial activities as evidenced in the above paragraph, he did not believe that the state had a role in centralizing and planning commercial activities. Kautilya felt no need for either price, production, or quantity controls for consumer goods. There shall be no restriction on the time of sale of those commodities for which there is frequent demand, nor shall they be subject to the evils of centralization, sankuladosha. The state as a facilitator. The Kautilyan state considered it its duty to facilitate transactions. It also deemed it important to regulate the nature of transactions for the maximum welfare of the state. In terms of facilitating commercial activities, Kautilya laid stress on the removal of thorns to society by protecting artisans, guilds, and the commercial interests. In the Kautilyan state, those who conspire to lower the quality of the works of artisans, to hinder their income, or to obstruct the sale or purchase shall be fined. Given the pride of place in current literature, i.e., in economics, political science, and public policy, to transaction costs and the business environment, Kautilya was indeed addressing economic issues that continue to remain serious concerns of the modern state. In some ways, Kautilya's stress on the state as a regulator is very interesting. He favored free trade and believed that the state should create mechanisms to protect and promote commercial activities. At the same time, he favored a situation where the state should have a major role in the conduct of commerce. The Department of Commerce in the Kautilyan system had a very important role as facilitator. It also had distinct roles in domestic commercial policy and trade policy. The Superintendent of Commerce shall ascertain demand or absence of demand for, and rise or fall in the price of various kinds of merchandise which may be the products either of land, or of water, and which may have been brought in either by land or by water. He shall also ascertain the time suitable for the distribution, centralization, purchase, and sale. Institution building. The Kautilyan idea of institution building for states and markets, and the emphasis laid on them is similar to modern ideas. Kautilya realized that setting domestic standards and institutionalizing them through laws was very essential. To this effect, he recommended a separate superintendent of weights and measures who would strictly enforce such standards in the market. The importance of exacting standards was not lost on Kautilya. Weights, pratamani, shall be made of iron or of stones available in the countries of Magadha and Mekhala, or of such things as will neither contract when wetted, nor expand under the influence of heat. In our modern world, the concept of maintaining market confidence through maintenance of effective standards has been thoroughly institutionalized. The idea of standards has expanded to include various issues such as health and safety, labor, environment, etc. Kautilya laid down very strict rules on what constitutes a legal agreement, the role of trial and transparency, and the importance of having the maximum amount of information to resolve all disputes fairly. Kautilya stands out among ancient philosophers for having identified and proposed such a refined, given the antiquity, idea of contracts and their legal basis. For Kautilya, the element of transparency in agreements was foremost. All agreements needed to have witnesses, needed to be recorded, and the witnesses could not be those who had a criminal record, i.e. condemnable. Those were the good old days. In Kautilyan times, oral contracts that were otherwise unlawful were valid. Those who voluntarily heard such contracts, stroti, could bear witness to it. Contracts were declared invalid if, for example, one of the parties to it or the witness was under provocation, anxiety, intoxication, or was a lunatic. The Arthashastra is also perhaps the earliest treatise known in history to recognize the collective legal rights of a group or body of people. In Kautilyan India, there were groups of merchants and professionals organized together into shrenas, or cooperatives who specialized in some economic activity. In essence, they were early representations of the modern idea of the firm or corporation. Kautilya allowed intra-firm contracts as acceptable. Agreements entered into by members of any association, shrenas, among themselves shall be valid though entered into in private. Kautilya also emphasized that disputes could be among merchants or trade guilds, i.e., a body of people and another party. Kautilya also laid out laws for contracts that involved cooperative undertakings or joint efforts. In fact, the idea of the contract, and the agents who can enter into them, is extended. The above rules, i.e., the rules of agreements, shall also apply to countries, desa, castes, families, and assemblies. This is a surprisingly evolved idea, and Kautilya is the first known source to enunciate such a comprehensive view of the nature of contracting parties to include individuals, firms, communities as well as nations and states. Desa. The process of arbitration and trial that ensures proper enforceability of contracts has been given much importance in Arthashastra. Kautilya laid stress on the proper registration of cases with the maximum information. He also recommended harsh fines and punishment for those who give wrong information. Kautilya recommended the year, the season, the month, the fortnight, paksha, the date, the nature and place of the deed, the amount of the debt as well as the country, the residence, the caste, the gotra, the name and occupation of both the plaintiff and the defendant, both of whom must be fit to sue and defend. Kratasamarthavasteo. Having been registered first, the statements of the parties shall be taken down in such order as is required by the case. These statements shall then be thoroughly scrutinized. To maintain transparency in the arbitration and trial process, Kautilya forbids the idea of counter-suits. In cases other than duels, robbery, as well as disputes among merchants or trade guilds, the defendant shall file no counter-case against the plaintiff. In the Kautilyan system, there is a provision for adjournment to give the defendant time to prepare his brief, and as such is in consonance with modern ideas of arbitration. Kautilya states that the defendant may be allowed 3 or 7 nights to prepare his defense. If he is not ready with his defense within that time, he shall be punished with a fine. Our present judicial system, with its backlog of lakhs of cases, could do with such a strict adherence to time standards. The Kautilyan arbitration system recognized several kinds of disputes and categorized them under different heads with detailed instructions on the specific nature and treatment of such disputes. The Arthashastra recognized disputes related to buildings, sale of buildings, boundary disputes and those related to the determination of boundaries, disputes related to land and water resources, non-performance of agreements, recovery of debts, disputes concerning deposits, cooperative undertakings, disputes related to merchants and trade guilds, rescission of purchase and sale without ownership, disputes related to titles and ownership and defamation. State intervention. Kautilya identified several areas of state intervention and appointed officials to facilitate the economic life of the country. They are as follows. 1. The superintendent of slaughterhouse. 2. The superintendent of prostitutes. 3. The superintendent of ships. 4. The superintendent of passports. 5. The office of the city superintendent. Kautilya's idea of the passport corresponds to the modern version of this document that facilitates movement of people. This is perhaps the first instance of an institutionalized concept of passports that regulated the flow of people across borders. Kautilya said that, whoever is provided with a pass shall be at liberty to enter into, or go out of the country. Whoever, being a native of the country enters into or goes out of the country without a pass shall be fined 12 panas. He shall be punished with the first amusement for producing a false pass. A foreigner guilty of the same offense shall be punished with the highest amusement. Prevention of unfair trade practices. Kautilya realized that the role of the state was to ensure that commercial activities do not violate laws or are harmful for the consumer, and if the state did not establish and enforce codes of conduct, it would, in fact, raise transaction costs. The lack of trust and guarantee of quality would diminish commerce and increase search and verification costs for agents undertaking commercial transactions. Kautilya explicitly states, adulteration of grains, oils, alkalis, salts, scents, and medicinal articles with similar articles of no quality shall be punished with a fine. The consumer or buyer is provided safeguards by Kautilya, i.e., the sale or mortgage of articles such as timber, iron, brilliant stones, ropes, skins, earthenware, threads, fibrous garments, and woolen clothes as superior, though if they are really inferior shall be punished with a fine. It is interesting to note that Kautilya tried to establish guidelines for professional service providers also, including weavers, washermen, boatmen, shipping agents and even prostitutes. Modern states are still grappling with the complexity of setting such service-oriented guidelines, and in that light Kautilya's attempts at the same shows the sheer breadth of his vision at such an early point in history. Kautilya also established explicit guidelines for the practice of the medical profession, incorporating ideas that seem strangely modern, i.e., physicians undertaking medical treatment without intimating to the government the dangerous nature of the disease shall, if the patient dies, be punished with the first amusement. If the death of a patient under treatment is due to carelessness in the treatment, the physician shall be punished with the middlemost amusement. Growth of disease due to negligence or indifference, karmavada, of a physician shall be regarded as assault or violence. For Kautilya, the welfare of the state and the people of the state were paramount. It is natural that Kautilya would recommend measures that would safeguard consumers from price escalation and inflation. Kautilya sees the solution through strict control of market behavior, including setting the upper floor for prices. Thus, in some ways, Kautilya was an advocate of price controls in the domestic market. Unfortunately, some people interpret this as planned or control economy. In reality, Kautilya's policies, when seen in totality, represent a very pro-merchant and artisan stance, with the state playing the role of facilitator and protector of commercial interests. But the Kautilyan state, like any modern state, saw the welfare of citizens as priority, and thus safeguards against monopoly behavior and price escalation had to be factored into the bargain. Kautilya showed an understanding of collusive and monopoly behavior and created safeguards to protect the market and consumers from its ill effects. Kautilya clearly stated, merchants who conspire either to prevent the sale of merchandise or to sell or purchase commodities at higher prices shall be fined. To ensure that consumers and traders received a fair price, Kautilya says, the superintendent of commerce shall fix a profit of 5% over and above the fixed price of local commodities, and 10% on foreign produce. Merchants who enhance the price or realize profit even to the extent of half a panna more than the above in the sale or purchase of commodities shall be punished with a fine. But Kautilya is perceptive enough and flexible enough to realize that the state official might not be able to gauge the market. He thus states that, in case of failure to sell collected merchandise wholesale at the fixed rate, the rate shall be altered. Kautilya envisaged a role for the state to ensure that excessive price fluctuation detrimental to commercial activities did not occur. Kautilya showed a highly refined understanding of the law of demand and supply and the pernicious effects of gluts in the market. It is important to reiterate here that Kautilya'S Arthashastra is the first known treatise to discuss such concepts, and thus Kautilya is indeed the father of economics. Kautilya recommended an interventionist policy in case of gluts in the market, i.e., whenever there is an excessive supply of merchandise, the superintendent shall centralize its sale and prohibit the sale of similar merchandise elsewhere, before the centralized supply is disposed of.